Howdy, 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 howdy. How are we all doing? You are hanging with the beast. We're doing episode 18 of Give Me Back My 90s Music. And today we are discussing a very sensitive topic for some, a very important topic, and I think a very controversial topic that I have heard about, that I have seen coming back around, that I think many of us who like to have everything to do with music kind of talk about. The question is Nirvana. And what we're talking about when it came to Nirvana, were they overrated and were they the true face of the 90s grunge era when it came to music? Because let's face it, in the 90s, you couldn't go anywhere without whacking yourself into a wall and it being something to do with Nirvana. Now, to be quite fair, objective, I will say that I always felt that Nirvana's best work, to me, its most pure work, was Bleach, because I felt Bleach was a non-polished, cut down to the treads type of album. It was no holds barred. It was in your face. It was punk. It was just dirty, filthy, but everything wonderful. There's something in those early tracks that I think you can really feel, as opposed to other tracks that came from the band, of course. And I'm not going to sit here and say Nevermind was a phenomenal album. I think In Utero was a very good album as well, but I don't think anything comes close to Bleach and Nevermind. Now, Nevermind, of course, was a much more polished album, had a lot more money behind it, I suppose, and therefore, obviously did not have that hardcore punk-like sound that the first album came from. And maybe sometimes it's a case of a band or a group kind of going from a primal place to a more relaxed setting where they want to try some things out. But whatever the case may be, both albums were phenomenal. And in fact, it was weird because on In Utero, I heard the song the other day. You could not get away with the song "Rate Me" today, which is a phenomenal song, especially the lyrics. Rate me again, rate me my friend. I don't think you get away with that. They would probably, this cancel culture bullshit would also probably have a problem with Frances Farmer will have her revenge on Seattle. Well, we'll gain her revenge on Seattle. I'm sure they would make a fight to say it's not nice to point and make fun of, or you're looking down at Frances Farmer, whatever the case may be. Even you could even say for a heart-shaped box, because supposedly he's singing about Courtney Love's vagina, which is interesting. And therefore, some of the lyrics about cancer and whatnot, I'm sure you couldn't get away with half the things that were going on in the 90s. But I think it's interesting to look at their transition from album to album. So you go from Bleach, which is really hardcore punk, Negative Creep, Floyd the Barber, and then you go to again, it's a primal punk, no holds barred, if this is it type thing, to Nevermind, which is much more in a controlled atmosphere, yet has a little bit of that punk sound, a little bit of that grungy sound. And then you go to In Utero, which is a little laid back as opposed to the other two albums, but a little, kind of controversial with those other songs that I just mentioned. Again, I think they're all phenomenal albums. But what we're talking about, there's a lot of conversation sometimes, a lot of people who hate Nirvana. And I understand that there's people who just don't like certain groups. But I think that when you have an appreciation for music, primarily from a certain time period, you have to appreciate things and be objective, while at the same time being opinionated and subjective. So it's always kind of, the best of both worlds. But I always felt that Nirvana, and again, they didn't do anything wrong. Like, this was not their doing. If you know anything about Kurt Cobain, there's that wonderful video out there that I've mentioned before where he's told that Madonna gets a certain amount of money per show, and how much the tickets cost. And he's like, are you kidding me? I think that the powers that be used them for the narrative at the time, because the times were changing. 90, 91, obviously we had come over from the hair metal days and the ballads of the 80s, and now we're in this new era where we're getting this primal, wonderful music that we don't know what to do with. So we need to kind of paint a picture to show that we have control over the situation and that we know what's going on and this is the new thing. And I think they took them in their glory when they had hit it big with Smells Like Teen Spirit. Because let's face it, for the most part, those who didn't know much about Nirvana did not discover them until Nevermind was all over the place. And I say this not because he's my brother and one of my best buddies and one of the most smartest people when it comes to music, but my older brother, Christian, had Bleach long before Nevermind. He was blasting that long before I heard Nevermind. I mean, he was Negative Creep and all that stuff. And, I kind of feel that the narrative was, well, here's the hit, here's the thing, what is this thing, let's get on top of this, let's get control of this, and here's the people we can put at the forefront. When, to be kind of fair, there were other groups that could have been in that conversation. Of course, one of them being, maybe it was early Pearl Jam, which was Mother Love Bone. It could have been Soundgarden. It could have been Allison Chains, or I can't say Stone Temple Pilots really, because it seemed to me, obviously, Stone Temple Pilots came after that, of course, but obviously their inaugural album, which was Core, put them on the map, of course. And it seemed to me that the powers that be weren't looking out west and weren't looking on the East Coast. They were doing this. They kind of looked on and found Nirvana at that time. It could also put Temple of the Dog in there as well, I believe. And again, there's other bands that we could, put in that category. Who was the face of the 90s? And I don't just think it's one band. I mean, when you look at Nirvana, of course, they were active since 1987. And, their early work wasn't really that famous until Nevermind was on the map. I mean, Bleach came out in 89, and when you just kind of look at it at the time, just in terms of sales, yeah, they did sell. I mean, again, this isn't telling me when they sold, but they did sell 1,900,000 albums in the United States. Now, I don't know how true those numbers are. I'm wondering, were a lot of those sales after Nevermind? Sometimes we see that happen. You see a band put out a real hit album, and then everybody goes back and wants to see their earlier work and goes and buys it and whatnot, as opposed to Nevermind, which blew everything off the charts that it could possibly. I mean, it sold 10 million albums in the United States. It sold over 1 million in the United Kingdom. It sold over 1 million in Germany and France. It sold over 1 million in Canada. So do the math. You're talking 15 million albums and climbing. So I'm going to say that because of that album, it catapulted the other ones to do rather well with sales. And then Utero, of course, even though that was their third album and had come after Nevermind, obviously a lot of bands have trouble trying to capitalize on an album and put it out when they've had such wonderful luck with it, that the next album that comes out usually doesn't do as good as it possibly as that one. This one had 5 million sales in the United States alone. I'm sure those numbers have gone up, but nowhere near as much as Nevermind. So I've always wondered, what was it that the powers that be had kind of put Nirvana as the face of the 90s? And I say that because you find that so many different times. Whenever you hear about the 90s, the first thing you always see is Nirvana. And I always wondered why. Now, of course, the East Coast was much different than Seattle. Seattle had a much different music scene than we did, of course, because we didn't have that great grunge movement going on here in the 90s. I think it had to come from Seattle in order to become really big here. I'm sure there were a good bunch of people that were already into it. If you go to talk about Soundgarden was around 3 years prior to Nirvana since 1984 on the same label, by the way. They were on the same label at one point, Sub Pop Records. I don't think they were on the same label later on. But their first album, came out in '88, a year before Nirvana's, which was Ultra Mega OK. And, it only consisted of 13 songs, some of which I've never heard. I've never heard of, but to be quite fair. And I'm wondering, again, I'm just looking at some numbers. I can't see how well it sold. I don't know how well it did, but I'm going to think that it didn't, obviously do as well as their later work. Louder Than Love came in '89. It was recorded actually between '88 and '89, and it was their second album, of course. And songs like Hands All Over, Gun, Get on the Snake, Loud Love, obviously, Big Dumb Sex. Again, I'm not seeing much in terms of numbers of what it sold, although I do see that it was 108 on the Billboard. And of course, it wasn't until, Bad Motor Finger in 1991 and Super Unknown that really put them on the map. But if you're talking timeline, they were around long, not too long ago, but a good amount of years before Nirvana. Now, of course, from the time of the genesis of each group or most groups, there's always that time in the middle from when they start to when they really make it big that they've been doing the work, whether it's, hitting the indie circuit, touring on smaller levels, whatever. But whatever the case may be, you may not hear about them as much during that time, but they're doing the work. So that's understandable sometimes to not hear what they've done. But then sometimes, things happen, and the first thing a band puts out is just, gold. When you look at Pearl Jam, they were started in 1990 as Pearl Jam. That being said, we all know that they were formed after the demise of Stone Gossett and Jeff Ammon's previous band, which was Mother Love Bone, of course. Mother Love Bone consisted of Bruce Fairweather, Stone Gossett, Greg Gilmore, Jeff Ammon, and the late Andrew Wood. So it wasn't really Pearl Jam, but it had members of Pearl Jam in there. And then, of course, there was Temple of the Dog, which consisted of Matt Cameron, Jeff Ammon, Eddie Vedder, Stone Gossett, Chris Cornell, and Mike McCready. And they were started in 1990, okay, as a tribute to the late Andrew Wood, of course. So obviously, Pearl Jam came later, but the roots were other places. I mean, they were also known as Mookie Blaylock, which is still one of my favorite stories and one of my favorite names. He was a phenomenal player. That being said, though, to be fair, the early years of Pearl Jam, Stone Gossett and Jeff Emmett were members of a band called Green River during the mid-'80s. So there's the roots right there. Obviously, things didn't come together until later. In late '87, they began playing with Andrew Wood, and then finally they organized Mother Love Bone. In '88 and '89, they recorded and toured to increase the interest. Unfortunately, Mother Love Bone only released one album called Apple, and it was 4 months after Andrew Wood's unfortunate death of a heroin overdose. And of course, from there, everybody knows, they met the other members of the band, and obviously they met Eddie Vedder later on. He was lead singer for a band called Bad Radio. And for the most part, they came after Nirvana. And the good thing about Pearl Jam was, their first album, 10, as a band, was just a mega hit. So I don't know if you could put them in the category. In terms of the earliest group, I don't know if they'll be there because obviously timeline wise, it's Soundgarden, then Nirvana, then Pearl Jam, and I say Pearl Jam as a whole because again the roots were earlier, but in other groups they weren't together as a group called Pearl Jam at the time. Then you look at Allison Chains, okay, who was formed in 87. All right. By guitarist Jerry Cantrell and drummer Sean Kinney. They recruited bassist Mike Starr and lead vocalist Lane Staley. Starr was obviously replaced by Mike Innes in 93. But again, if you look at their early years, they were around since 84. Okay. Staley was the lead singer. They were a glam metal band, which is they weren't what they were at first. Staley was singing in the glam metal band called Sleaze, I believe. And let's see, he met guitarist Jerry Cantrell in 87. So again, the roots being put down earlier, obviously. And let's see. Obviously their first body of work was in 1990 off the first album, which was called Facelift. So again, their first album didn't come till 1990, which of course is after Nirvana's 1989 Bleach. But again, out of these four bands, I was always curious to know why Nirvana was kind of picked as to be at the forefront. When I think it's kind of fair to say that there was a lot more going on in that scene. And think about some of the bands that we didn't really know about, or weren't for some reason or another at the top of the food chain that time, like Nirvana was, because there had to be a good amount of them that were there. You know, some of the acts that we know about from that time. One that came out of Washington was the Melvins. Not a group I'm really too familiar with, to be quite honest. And just looking, the Melvins were formed in 1983 in Washington, and I'm sure I've heard stuff by them. I just don't know exactly, something I can name off the top of my head. And they were described as sludge metal, whatever. What the fuck is sludge metal? I can't even imagine what that means. But supposedly they influenced a lot of bands such as Nirvana, Soundgarden, and others. So that's a group that we're talking about too, that maybe have made it to the type of stardom that these other four bands have made. But it's amazing to me to think about who put what where, and who put this group to be here. That was always something I had found rather interesting. Another band come out of Seattle, Washington was Mudhoney, and I got to be honest, I've never really heard much by them. I'm sure I'm missing out, but they were around since 1988. And it's amazing how so many of these band members, they knew each other in the scene. They were part of each other's groups, which I always found to be fascinating. Them too were with Sub Pop from 1988 to 1991. And again, I don't, obviously they didn't have the type of crazy stardom that these other four bands do, and it's really rare that I think you see that. But Mudhoney does, it was well known to an extent, I want to say. Obviously not to the extent that some of these other bands were. But it's always interesting to see, what you wonder why. That's the question. One of the bands to come out of the East Coast, obviously, was Sonic Youth. Again, they were with Sub Pop Records, and I feel that obviously they didn't have the type of silly, crazy stardom that Nirvana, Allison Chains, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden did. But I think that if you know your music well enough, they were on the ground floor of the scene big time, and they had a pretty interesting lineup. Kim Gordon, Thurston Moore. Just looking at a lot of what they did, and I can admit to you that I'm not too familiar with a lot of their music, and it's probably shame on me. But they had a shitload of albums. I mean, going back to 1983, two, three, four, five different albums in the 80s. So this is early stuff, man. These are earlier groups. Maybe not from Seattle, but this from the East Coast. And then if you want to talk even a different, go out west, and a band again, another band that I'm really not too familiar with, although I did see them open live at Dysfunctional Family Picnic in either '99 or 2000, were the Deftones, who were really well known on the West Coast and are still together and have been together since 1988. Um, you could put them in there too. I mean, obviously longevity is very important and is a thing when it comes to these groups. But what's funny is that the Deftones didn't put out their first album till 1995, which is very interesting because they had been together for a bit before that. So I'm always curious to know as to who decided that somebody was going to be the face of everything. And again, when I say overrated, I don't think Nirvana was overrated as a band. I don't think they were overrated when it came to talent. I say it is, why did the powers that be feel the need to kind of put them as the face of the 90s when there were so many other groups that could have been in there? Why did it have to be a singular thing instead of a plural thing? Because when we think of the big four, we obviously think of four wonderful, phenomenal bands. Now, who's better or not, I think is a matter of opinion, is a matter of taste, is a matter of subjectivity. Obviously, depending on how you're doing that, because all four bands, for all intents and purposes, were extremely tight, have extremely talented musicians, wrote some of the greatest songs with great lyrics, and just created you know, their own version of things. I think that the '90s was a much more plural type of, to put one group there is really hard to do. It kind of reminds me of when we try and say who was the greatest front person of the band in the '90s, and I don't think there's one great answer. And it brings me back to other questions similar to that, like who's the greatest basketball player of all time, who's the greatest pitcher of all time, things like that. It's hard to say, depends on many different aspects. I think that when you put opinion in there, yeah, you can kind of summarize, and come up with an answer. But when you weigh things, out of those groups, you say, well, who was the real deal? Who was the best out of all four? It's really hard to say. If you're going to talk in terms of album sales, well, that's one way. I think that's a silly way to do it because, again, that's based off of subjectivity as well, and who knows how true those numbers really are. If you're talking about numbers of albums, we come back to the same argument. If you talk about who had the better, who has the better legacy, I think you can kind of really compare three of those bands because three of those lead singers aren't there anymore. Kurt Cobain is dead, Lane Staley is dead, and Chris Cornell is dead. So legacy is really good. I mean, I think you can say the same for all of them in terms of legacy. Now, in terms of longevity, you've got Pearl Jam, who is clearly winning that race. So does that put them at the front of the race? I don't know. I couldn't tell you because obviously Soundgarden's not together anymore. Nirvana is not together anymore. Allison Chains is together, but of course, different members, especially in terms of lead singers. So it's really hard to wonder who was the face of the 90s. Why were they considered to be the face of the 90s? Why were they considered to be, the group of the 90s? I just think that, yeah, maybe they were obviously definitely one of them. But the 90s, we forget, for those 10 years, there was so much going on, and we saw music change overnight, and we saw so many other groups jumping onto the pile, whether it's Stone Temple Pilots, Smashing Pumpkins, Nine Inch Nails, and so many others. Rage Against the Machine, and on we go. So it's really hard to just pinpoint one group. But I think that's what a lot of happens when it comes to trying to, put everything together in a pile. I guess you want to have this one element on the front cover that kind of speaks for everybody else, but I don't think it's really doable like that. I think it's much more intense and it's much more deeper than that. So that's why I think you have to kind of talk about the 90s as a variety of different groups and singers and bands and whatnot. You can't just really put one thing out there that speaks about it. It's so much deeper than that. And I think that if you look in terms, okay, let's break things down like this, right? In terms of lead singers, like obviously the greatest vocal talent out of all of them, I'm talking about in terms of octaves and stuff like that, is Chris Cornell. I mean, he has the most powerful voice out of all those groups. I think that's kind of hands down a well-known thing. If you're talking in terms of individuality in just like uniqueness, well, then I have to go with Lane Staley, because he had a very unique voice. And you could even say that Allison Chains had a very unique sound, different away from all three of those other bands, and not just those three bands, but other bands as well. So, in terms of being, who had the better musicians, well, that's a real hard one to kind of sum up because if you're talking guitarist, I mean, you got Jerry Cantrell, one of the best there is, Kim Thale, and on we go. It's really hard to just do that. But again, I think we always come back to when I say overrated, there are many that feel that Nirvana was overrated. Now, they only did put out 3 studio albums. Incesticide was another album they had, but never really seemed to get as much. That was one of those albums that kind of got big after the fact of Nevermind. And again, I think that it's something you have to look into deeper because then you have to kind of look at Soundgarden and say, okay, well, after Bad Motorfinger, you had Super Unknown and Down on the Upside. Then they broke up and kind of did that last album, which I've still never heard. And Pearl Jam has just, kept going and everything and just, they just stand the test of time. So I overrated, I don't know. I don't think you obviously not overrated in terms of talent. I think maybe you could feel that way because they were put at the forefront, but it wasn't by their choice. I think they were catapulted when they really started to figure out that this was the band we were going to get behind and push them forward. And sometimes it really sucks because I think that you have to look under the umbrella of things to find so many other elements that aren't on the top. You know how sometimes with a cake on the surface it looks amazing and then you cut into it and it's absolute shit, or you cut into it and there's multiple layers and there's all these goodies in there. It's sort of like that, man. I think that's the case for it because I think that, and I say this, and I don't say this in a good way. Unfortunately, the young, unfortunate death of Kurt Cobain caused the powers that be to create a narrative to kind of, use his death as a way to skyrocket the band even more. Because I remember back in the day, there were people who didn't know shit about Nirvana, and after Kurt Cobain died, it was like every fucking teenage girl who wasn't into grunge started wearing a T-shirt, as opposed to all the cool ass Timberland boot wearing chicks who were, deep into it. Were like, well, where were you when Kurt Cobain was alive? It was an unfortunate, horrible thing that the man died, and then I think that they tried to capitalize off his death and trying to, push everything forward. It sucks when that happens, and I'm sure it's happened with so many other groups of singers as well. It's unfortunate that that's what happens because it shouldn't be. The appreciation should always be when they're alive and creating, as opposed to when they're not here no longer. Of course, you want their legacy to live on. Like unless you're Elvis, who just keeps getting more and more famous, I don't know what to tell you, man. And he hasn't been alive for, since 1977, but he's getting more and more famous. All the time. It's funny. I went to this show a couple years ago at Radio City Music Hall with my father, and it was the Elvis Presley experience. It was Elvis on a large screen with his original band actually playing in Lifetime. And when I told you the place was sold out for both nights, and afterwards I was online to get a souvenir, I waited almost 2 hours. I remember looking at my father going, holy shit, he hasn't been alive for so long and he's still fucking selling out the building. You go figure. So, again, I don't think that obviously that type of fame happens only once in a lifetime. But I think that you have to look at both sides of the train tracks here when it comes to Nirvana or bands that have put out, a small amount of work as compared to those that have a large, extensive library, like Pearl Jam. You have to look at what they put out while they were together. And again, I think that Nevermind stands by itself as one of the greatest albums of all time, one of the greatest albums of the 90s. But I think that you don't have a Nevermind unless you have an appreciation for Bleach, because Bleach is really where the root work was and what they were still trying to learn to be. And sometimes it works one of two ways. You get an inaugural album such as Core, such as Pearl Jam's 10, and that's where, you hear all the greats, things, the wonderful things. You don't have an album like a Bleach before that to hear what they were kind of working out, the kinks and whatnot. So it works both ways. But I think no matter what, they will definitely go down as one of the most as one of the greatest bands of the 90s, and as well as of all time. And I'd love to hear from you guys to see your opinion on this. Please feel free to comment. Hit me at Instagram, hit me at Facebook. If you get a chance, go to YouTube and like the page. I really appreciate it. Much love and respect to all those who like the page and are listening. And I'll be coming back at you soon with some more excellent content. This is The Beast, and I'm going to be out.